Welcome back to Next Step Espresso. Although this is season 2, welcome to season 2 of Next Step Espresso.
Thank you for having me again.
It's great to have you back. For people who might not have listened to a previous episode, just give us a quick summary of who you are and why we should care what you say.
I mean, you don't have to if you don't want, but my background is in sports nutrition. So I did an undergraduate in sports science. I've got a master's in sports nutrition. I've worked with athletes in pretty much every sport you can think of. I've now sort of shifted to work with people on their relationship with food, weight loss, mindset around food. And I also do some corporate wellness stuff as well. So I basically just try and do everything because I get really bored really easily. So
yeah,
I dabble in everything.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. And when you say every sport you can think of, I mean, curling?
Dabbled a little bit in testing with curling at uni once.
Okay.
With one curling athlete.
Well, one curling athlete, yeah, fair enough. What about squirrel water skiing?
See, actually, with the Utah Squirrel Water Skiing Championship side.
Oh, nice.
Did a little bit of work with them. Yeah.
I watched them on. Yeah, I watched them on ESPN8 The Ocho. Actually, they did well.
They did, yeah.
And if people haven't seen the film Dodgeball, both references will be lost. Cool. Yeah. Well, it's great to have you here, particularly as we're talking about podcast misinformation. It's nice to hear your credentials. And it's difficult, right? Because there are numerous podcasts out there with equally qualified people who talk about nutrition and fitness, and then some of it's good and some of it's not so good. I think it's the biggest thing I get from people all the time is like, how do I know that, I can trust this person? How do I know if this person's talking bollocks or not?
I think that's the hard thing. And I've never had a right answer for this because I don't know. I don't know how, my only answer is, how do I know someone? It's because I know the research first that I can then say, well, actually what they're pushing out is pretty good.
Yeah.
But then I also think there's an element of some people do a really good job most of the time, but none of us are perfect and know everything and have read everything. So you might still get from a very good podcast misinformation.
Yeah.
So there are some people that probably intentionally try and confuse you. There's some people who are wrong intentionally, and there are some people that do a good job most of the time and then sometimes say stuff that you think, well, actually, I don't think that is true, or I'd argue with that.
Yeah, or I'd like debate that you could interpret that a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the issue, isn't it, Charlie? Because I tell you who does a really good series on this is Dr. John Berardi, who started Precision Nutrition, did a podcast for a while, and his podcast was based on a series of interviews with a bunch of people, and then he'd compile them together, and he did a 3-part series on I'm calling BS, and it was about when is it okay to call people out, or is it ever okay to call people out, and are people intentionally lying to make a quick buck, or are they honest in their interpretation of the research? They've had a good personal response from their viewpoint, and therefore they genuinely believe that that's the best way, and therefore they're genuinely trying to help people see the light that they've seen.
Yeah.
And it's because that's, for me, I've obviously got a good view of people. I would honestly want that to be the case, as opposed to someone genuinely being disingenuous just to make money.
Yeah. I'm the same, but I think the fitness industry really challenges your ability to think like that, because there are a lot of people out there that are in it to some extent for financial gain. And obviously we all are. So we've all got some sort of vested interest, or most of us. There aren't that many people that I know of that do a podcast on nutrition and fitness and health, but then have no other sort of way of earning from it. So they just do it for recreationally. That's not that common. So actually everyone's putting out information to some extent to try and come across like an expert or relatable. So actually, if we were to be completely honest, we've all got a bias about the information that we put out. And I guess the other thing is that you mentioned interpretation, that is science, is that you can have a theory or an idea or some research and we interpret it differently. And that's not one of us is right or wrong. That's how science works. And it's those different interpretations in research that makes people go and will think, well, actually, I think if we did this, you wouldn't see that and your hypothesis would be wrong. And they go and do that research, and that's healthy. That's the point of science. So to not agree with each other, I'm sure there are things we don't agree on. That's not judgment on either of us or our ability or our knowledge. That's just sometimes we interpret things differently, and that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with that. You know, there'd probably be different research that you and I could talk about now, and say like I interpret that differently, or I would argue that that could say something else, and research as well is limited in its limitations, right? You've got that sounds like such a shit phrase, but like, you know, depending on the research you're looking at, even if it's a review, which for people who are you know, new to research or don't understand it very much, you know, a review is a collation of other papers that they then look at and extrapolate data from and try to provide summaries of. You're limited by the papers that you choose. And then you're limited by each of those papers in terms of the models that were used, whether it was like a big cohort study or a small study, and how long it was, and how well it was controlled, and whether it was just an observational study. And all of these different factors make a huge difference into the conclusion. And the conclusion always just says, based on this data, we may assume X, but here's how we could do more to find out more about Y. And then that's all you've got.
Yeah.
And I think the issue in nutrition is like, you'll get one paper that wouldn't even say there's a connection between eating eggs and getting rectal cancer. But then what gets pushed out to the public is like, have more than 2 eggs a minute and you'll die of rectal cancer within 5 seconds. I mean, those timelines don't make sense, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And also, like, we would hope that people's interpretation is wrong, and we get that, but we'd hope the authors are at least like really hesitant to make firm conclusions on stuff, and that's not always the case. They'll do research where you think the design of that wasn't great, or it doesn't measure what you think it does, and their conclusion will be, well, we can clearly see from this data that, and you'll think, well, I can't clearly see that because the way you've studied that, I don't think actually answers the question that you're asking. I can think of 2 really good examples actually, because I think they help people in terms of like research and how you can interpret it differently. One is, and we were going to come on to it eventually, that Tim Spector podcast with Stephen Bartlett, and he was talking about sort of natural unprocessed food versus highly processed food, and he said we know that they're different because there's this study where they put people in a semi-enclosed prison and then gave them either homemade meals or highly processed food, and the highly processed food people ate more because they went back to the buffet and ate another meal or ate more calories. And that's great, and those studies are important, and we understand the need for them and where they fit within science. But also, like, I don't know about you, but I don't eat my meals in a semi-enclosed prison brought to me by someone else and prepared by someone else. So immediately you can think, well, that's great, and it shows us something, but it doesn't show us the whole picture. And actually studying appetite and eating behavior is really tricky because you either have no control and let people do it at home, or you've got loads of control, but it's in a lab, and actually, like, no one eats in a lab, so immediately we haven't got some of the other environmental cues that might change how we eat. So I think that's one really good example. The other one, which I always think of, is like this idea that you can't lose weight and gain muscle at the same time, which is like a big fitness industry thing, whether you can do it or not. And there's some research showing that you can.
Yeah.
And this was showing, and people will look at that research and say, well, it was in untrained individuals because that's what the paper said. And then if you look at the data, the paper says they had at the start of the study a 1 rep max bench of like over 100 kilos on average.
Oh yeah, so it's like, how are these people untrained? They're definitely fucking not.
And
like,
actually, I listened
if I had a bench of 100 kilos, like lifting a weight, like
to start with, I'd be well happy. I'd be massive. But and then if you listen to the author talk about it, he was like, well, what happened was they used to be, I can't remember what it was, like in the army or firefighters or something, but they hadn't trained for a while. But the paper that they published in wouldn't let them say they used to be trained, but now they're not. And like, so they had to just put untrained. But everyone just looks and goes, they're untrained. That's why they can do it. And actually, again, there's more nuance to it. So I think those 2 examples are really nice for interpretation of research. Matters a lot.
Those two examples are good. And I mean, if I were to play devil's advocate, you could argue that there would be some okay, although newbie gains don't apply to these people, you could argue that there is some body recomposition going on, and there's some reclaimed muscle we all know that if you don't use it for a while, you lose it temporarily, but then it's refound quicker than if you would never to have done it in the first place.
Yeah,
with that kind of like re-establishment of muscle memory and all the rest of it.
And also, like the protein doses they have in those studies, which I don't know off the top of my head, were crazy high, like 2.4, 2.6,
That
2.8.
it was 2.4 to 2.7 grams per
Yeah,
kilo, I think it was.
yeah,
It was really high.
is almost like unnatural. Like you'd have to work hard for that. So
Oh yeah,
what we
like
know,
I'd have to have 270 grams of protein a day to do that,
yeah,
and that would be
exactly. And we know
that
that
would be huge.
like protein, like muscle mass gain, is primarily from protein synthesis rather than anything to do with energy. But energy is facilitated. So it could be that actually, even for someone who's more advanced training, if they ate really, really high protein and we're in a smaller deficit, you would still see a change because that's you've made up for the muscle protein synthesis loss through the calorie deficit by eating loads more protein. But we just don't know because there's not loads of data on it. But to just say it can't happen, I hate it. I see it on Instagram all the time. It can't happen. We know it doesn't happen. You have to be at maintenance for surplus. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I think that because you know at the very start of the podcast we said, how do you tell if someone's talking BS? And I wrote a blog on it because I was like, I want to help people understand how they might see red flags. And I think whenever you make an absolutist statement, that it's a red flag. Because even though like I've gone more towards anti-diet, intuitive eating land as opposed to like calorie deficit, macro land, I'm still aware of the research that's out there for both sides of the coin. And I'm careful within my language to say there is research to suggest that this will happen if you do this, as opposed to every person who ever does this will always experience this. So there's a difference between saying, I don't recommend MyFitnessPal anymore because there's a growing body of literature that shows that even within men, there are higher levels of disordered eating habits and eating disorders in this population that use MyFitnessPal, versus if you use MyFitnessPal, you will get an eating disorder. That's the difference. And you made an interesting point of environment as well, because going back to that study that Tim Spector mentioned, and it's interesting, highly processed foods versus like natural homemade foods, because you have to dig deep into the classification of this. Like, what does that actually mean? Because processed is a word that's thrown for all foods. And we could argue that, what's the level of processing? What foods are they actually talking about here? But also, as you said, people don't eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet in a prison. They eat a set portion of food at home, unless they actually go to an all-you-can-eat buffet. And then the all-you-can-eat buffet environment has the all-you-can-eat buffet effect anyway, because people are wanting to maximize, the money that they use. They eat quicker. There's a variety of flavors and textures and tastes, which also increases ad libitum food intake. It's just like it's apples and oranges.
No, 100%. I think that's the real difficulty with interpretation of research. And also, like you said, like, because it's, even if the research heavily leans towards this is going to happen, it doesn't mean it happens for everyone. So the MyFitnessPal example is great, is that there's that relationship, but you can interpret it two ways, can't you? You can say maybe that use of MyFitnessPal leads men to have this poor relationship with food and themselves, etc. Or do people that already have those predispositions to disordered eating and poor body image, are they more likely the ones to go to MyFitnessPal and use it? So and that's the difficulty with that sort of correlational research. It's not important, and it's not bad research, but it doesn't tell you the whole story necessarily. And you could easily come up, like me and you could come up with 5 or 6 different hypotheses for why there is that relationship quite easily, I think.
Yeah. And it's chicken and egg, as you said. It's like, which came first? Which came first, the disordered eating or the MyFitnessPal use? Or did they just like nicely come alongside each other? Because then you and I both know from work within personality profiling that different people will vibe maybe more with different habits and different different methods, and they'll have a different predisposition to the psychology around those behaviors and habits because they've got different brain chemistry, different personalities, and different histories. So it's, you've got to take all that into account, and I think that's just, whenever I hear an absolute statement, unless it's like really, really obviously true, like bench press is the single best exercise in the gym, then like then you have to argue that someone's talking shit. To be fair, like if I could do only one exercise for the rest of my life, it would be the snatch, but that's because I have the flexibility to express it, and it's a full body. You've got the deadlift, you've got the pull, you've got the turn, you've got the catch, and you've got the squat. And I mean, you've got to push up overhead to maintain that overhead squat position. So you basically got full body movement.
For any listeners, Johnny is modelling
Like me.
match as we go. So just for anyone that's listening, if you hear any weird grunting, that's
not. And my puppy's just attacked me as I've done that.
Yeah, rightly so as well. You got two fitness then.
Yeah, because she hates CrossFit, does Pepper, so she attacks me as I do.
Good, yeah.
And she's saying she's used to me lifting her and then squatting. Who needs weights when you've got puppies?
You're so confused. Like, what's he doing again? Doing this again? Why?
She's like, stop using me for your content, Dad. Put her in bed. Oh!
I had a great point to make that, and I can't remember what it was now. Oh, that's right. Yes. So with nutrition, I always think like if we look at medical treatment, for example, like say my knee blew up, someone might talk to me about different treatment options, and like everyone's okay with that. So like they could say, oh, we've got a surgical option, we've got like a management option without surgery, and everyone just seems okay with that concept. But when it comes to food, it's suddenly like you have to do it this way. This is the only way that our body could ever cope with it. I just think there's a real dissonance there between like in that one realm you're absolutely fine with options and that everyone's different and every case is different. But then suddenly it's nutrition and you're like, shit, we've got to do this way, and that's the only way you can do it. And that just baffles me.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about medical failings in nutrition till the cows come home.
Oh yeah, I don't want to talk about
That's probably it's probably a different episode. You know, doctors suggesting Slimming World or surgery, and things like that. And but I know that Dr. Spencer on Instagram is probably the best one to talk about obesity science and help, because obviously he's actually quite positive about the appetite suppressant drugs and things for helping people of quite larger sizes, but obviously talks about it in correlation with lifestyle patterns and all the rest of it. Going back to the Tim Spector podcast, because that's purely the one that's just on our mind, and that's not the only one that we could talk about. You know, I remember a couple of years ago, Stephen Gundry was on the Lewis Hall podcast, and he was talking about, and Gundry is the person who's written the Plant Paradox and talks about grapes being like sugar bombs that drive up your insulin and cause fat storage and all the rest of it. So there's more podcasts out there, but with the Tim Spector one, the word that I've not listened to it, which is why I wanted to bring you on to talk about it, because I know that you listened to it in order to actually get to grips with what was said, which could be contested or not. I mean, a lot of people, let's talk about some good about it, because a lot of people lost their shit around the whole like, oh, exercise doesn't actually help with losing weight. But the thing is that, you know, I'm reading Health at Every Size by Linda Bacon at the minute, which also, you know, has the same conclusion. Like, look at all these research papers, you know, for whatever reason, people's appetite either, you know, catches up and replaces it, or people overcompensate because they eat more because they're exercising because they think they need to. And by itself, it doesn't actually cause any dramatic weight loss.
Yeah. So, like you said, if we talk about the good of the podcast, first of all, it was generally was a very good podcast. And I think this gets lost because of the clips that obviously he didn't edit the clips. Someone else did. And there's even bits where he said stuff and it sounds like the pause sounds unnatural to the point where I think you've said more and it's being clipped out.
But I mean, media teams are going to produce clickbait, aren't they?
These media teams are worth a couple of quid, aren't they? So I imagine they've done their job properly and made it sound as controversial as they can. And even then,
£3 to be exact.
Even then, he's like maybe £4.
Maybe if they're really good.
He's still done a pretty good job overall. The exercise one's a great example where he said the evidence shows that it doesn't seem on its own to lead to weight loss, and everyone's lost their mind. But you've got to remember, he's an epidemiologist who looks at big data sets in lots of people, and that is what it shows generally.
Yeah, it does.
On a wider scale that it doesn't work. His explanation of why wasn't very satisfactory for me, because he started talking about metabolism. Every time he mentioned metabolism in the podcast, I think he did a really bad job of explaining it.
As if he didn't really understand what metabolism meant.
He said shutdown a couple of times. I was like, your body doesn't have shutdown mode. You'd be dead. That's what shutdown mode is death. So that wasn't great. But he also sort of said that as soon as you exercise, you get this like hunger straight away, and then your body adapts, like this evolutionary mechanism where you eat straight away. And like you become hungry, and that's not the case, I don't think. For some
No.
people, that is the case, but also we know that high intensity exercise, you actually get a suppression of
blunting.
appetite
Yeah.
in the short term. And we probably know that exercise and energy expenditure is probably regulated more like week by week in terms of timescale rather than hour by hour or day by day. So his explanation of why I don't think was great. I'm not sure we actually know why, because is it some sort of physiological mechanism, or is it like I think a lot of it is I've earned this, therefore I'm going to eat something else. And I think you'd be amazed how many people that is the case for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's different theories as to why, like with exercise and movement in general, particularly with high intensity, there's one theory to suggest the kind of like, fight or flight mechanisms being at play. And if you're in that sort of state of adrenaline, fight or flight, your body is, putting everything into movement. It's focused purely on movement.
Yeah, blood flows away from the gut and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and but then in that state as well, you're not wanting to sit down and digest a meal, because if you were doing that in the in the wild and you were running away from a tiger or a bear, your body would just be focused on fleeing and getting away or tackling the threat. And then once that stress is like dissipated and your body's calmed down back into the parasympathetic mode of rest and digest, your appetite might then stimulate to be like, right, we need to refuel, recover, repair. So that's like the idea of where there might be an initial blunting, followed then by that upkeep of hunger. But as you said, there's also the personal attitude of I've exercised, I need more food. I need this fuel, or I need to recover. And unless you're an endurance athlete,
calories you've burnt, and then how many calories you need afterwards.
Unless you're an endurance athlete doing,
not that much,
kilometers after kilometers after kilometers, because there's actually more undereating in sort of like high endurance sports than anything else, which is why there's a higher development of red S within those sports than anywhere else. But with your garden leisure activity in a gym, I remember being misinformed as a teenager. My mum and I would go to like, spin or fat burn or whatever at the gym and then be like, pizza.
Yeah. And I think there are probably restaurants that open up next to gyms, knowing that they're probably going to, if you can market it as like a healthy-ish place, people will go, well, it's not that bad. And I've just burnt all these calories, I'll go. So, yeah, I think there's loads of mechanisms. Another one is there's some research showing that certain activities, you get a bigger suppressive appetite than others. And it might be to do with the vertical displacement of your stomach. So things like running and skipping and things like that, you might get more blunting than cycling, for example, just because there's the movement up and down of the stomach, which might interfere with or change some of those hunger hormones like ghrelin and GLP-1 and things like that. So loads of different reasons. To say that everyone gets hungry after exercise all the time for every exercise, I think was a bit of an over.
Well, it's an absolute statement. Yeah, it's an absolute statement, isn't it? As we said. And something that got sent to me was the whole area around gut dysbiosis and leaky gut. And that was something that I just contested instantly from hearing the words leaky gut, because that for me is a buzz term. And I know that Tim's done a lot of decent research in the area of gut health. And when I was reading about Zoe, his protocol of like diet, individualization, the gut researchers who were evaluating his research and the protocols did say, it's interesting how promising the research is around individualization of, foods and microbes. However, the research is in limited participants, and to this state can't be causatively shown to that this will work. That you can't draw the conclusion that this is promising versus like, right now let's try and give you the exact foods to develop the exact microbes. They were like, it's just too much of a leap of faith right now to make. And not to mention that that suggestion also says like, here's a glucose monitoring system, let's monitor your blood glucose after every meal to find the ones that don't spike it as much, and then edit your diet accordingly. And the issues there are like, well, with perfectly healthy people who are eating a variety of foods and exercising regularly and getting plenty of sleep, they don't need to monitor their glucose spikes after each meal, because over time that system takes care of itself. Like that's what the body's designed to do. And the arguments against are also like, well, is there not a limit to which we should be minutely scrutinizing every single bite of food that goes into our system and trying to optimize exactly everything that we eat? Like, when does it become too much?
Yeah, 100%. I agree with all of that. I think to his credit, he said, with regard to the Zoe and the testing and stuff, he had a lot of offers from people after talk saying, we want to do like commercialize this. And he said, I'm not interested unless you've got millions of pounds to do the research. And then apparently one couple of people came up to him and he said that. And a couple of weeks later, they said, right, we've got the money, let's do it. And then he was like, cool. So actually, like you said, Zoe have funded a lot of research in COVID, but also in gut health as well, which is great. It was a bit disappointing the way he spoke about artificial sweetness with such certainty, saying like they definitely affect gut health and blood sugar regulation. And even on the Zoe website, I had a quick look and it was like, it's a bit up in the air at the minute. We don't know. Some studies showing it might, some showing that it doesn't affect it at all. I don't think you can conclusively say artificial sweeteners are fine for gut health. I don't think you can.
No.
I've got that data, but I don't think you can say they're bad either.
No.
And I said this on like the podcast I did about his podcast the other day. Like I've no interest either way. I'm highly interested, but I've got no vested interest. I don't want it to fall down on either side.
No.
I'd cut down on artificial sweetener use personally if I thought it was going to be better for me, but I don't think we know that yet.
No, and I think you could argue that, like, let's say you've had a day where you've had a couple of Pepsi Maxes, you've also had a protein bar, and you've had some protein powder within, like some yogurt or porridge, and then you've also used some like low calorie Flave drops within your coffee or whatever, and then you notice that your shit is a bit runny or you've got pretty bad farts. It's like, well, that's probably because of the sweeteners and the gas and the inulin and all the rest of it. And it's like, is that maybe a bit too much of all of those things?
Yeah.
And again, I'm just talking about personal experience. If I have more fiber within a day and fewer of those foods, then things move a little bit better. And then, so you can see the arguments of what they're saying in terms of the concentration. And because there's such an obsession over lower calorie alternatives, we're becoming a very sweetened world.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things that's worth mentioning there is those sorts of food that you've just spoke about are commonly consumed in like a fitness type lifestyle.
Yes.
Against like the context and backdrop of poor gut health anyway, like poor variety regardless. So like the typical fitness diet might be chicken, broccoli, and rice a couple of times a day with some like overnight oats with one portion of fruit in, and then a ton of sweeteners. So you've already not got much variety in your food, probably not got great gut health to start with, and then you're loading loads of sweeteners on, and that's probably where you get even more issues. Whereas if we, like you said, reduce sweetness slightly and had a high variety of plants that we consumed and all the other things that's good for the gut, you'd probably be fine and you wouldn't see any.
Be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the absolute statements and the limitations of your research that you always have to be aware of, I think, as a practitioner when you talk on podcasts to wide varieties of people, because even the tests that they've used with like the blue dye have been called under scrutiny, haven't they, with the experts of like, well, there's a lot of different conclusions that we can draw from this, and it's just interesting. I just hate the term leaky gut, but that's purely because of everything I've read from like Gab Vandaro and saying like, this isn't a diagnosed term and it's actually more about, but they obviously argue the dysbiosis and stuff does happen.
I do wonder if there's
be careful with your language
where he oversimplifies things to the point where it's just wrong. So actually, I don't think he's necessarily like incorrect or unaware of terms or like definitions or things like that. But he tries to be so simplistic and reductionist to try and communicate to Stephen, which is a tough job, that he ends up just being wrong. Yeah. And I think that's quite easy to do in like scientific communication, is you've got to try and simplify it down so much that people understand it, but sometimes you go a step too far and you've moved away from what the actual truth is, or you've started using terms that aren't accurate or aren't right. So I think that's maybe where he went with like, because I don't think he actually said you get like leaky gut syndrome. He said something like you get like a leaking of the gut, and then you think you could maybe contest that a little bit more.
I think that's probably again where like you get into the issue of having media people or teams of people write your bios and clip your podcasts for you, where it says leaky gut.
Yeah.
Because that's then the alarm bells that rang for me when I saw the summary that came through from a client of mine. What do you think of this podcast? A lot of it makes sense, and I think that's the issue. Is like if people have autoimmune diseases or things like that where their body doesn't work the same as ours anyway, like because they've got this condition from sort of chronic stress or whatever it is that's caused it, genetics, whatever. So even that whole landscape's very still unknown. If they say a lot of things about protocols and food groups and then relate them to their symptoms and then talk about a benefit of these symptoms when X has done Y, you're going to be like, oh my god, like this is it. This is, do you know what I mean? It's that almost causative leap of we've seen this in some people with Y, and then so everybody with Y is like, oh my god, I need to go and try this. And I'm not arguing that they shouldn't or it wouldn't help, but it's just because again, if you do see it in some people, then it's worth a shot. That's the thing as well. Like research, you'll get teams of people who it doesn't work for, teams of people it does work for, and then if the average was like, well, we don't really know. Well, if you're one of those people, you might as well try it because some people did respond positively to it.
Yeah. I think what's disappointing about him in the podcast at times is he makes this big absolutist like claim up front and then rationalizes afterwards. So like the
Right.
vitamins one, have you seen that? Like everyone talking about that don't like vitamins are a waste of time. He says that first, but then he says unless you've got some weird disease, which is a bit horrible, or deficiency. And I think, well, actually, like a lot of the time people do have some deficiencies and that's why they're supplementing. So actually what you've just said is vitamins are absolutely fine in the right context, but you've gone in with vitamins are a waste of time for everyone, except for those of you that should be taking them. Well, that's a point thing. So he does that a few times, obviously for clicks and for likes and stuff like that. It's just a bit of a shame that that's how it goes.
Yeah, and I think if we were to argue that, okay, well, you're better off probably having 30 different plant sources a week than just relying on a multivitamin.
Yeah.
We would agree. But as you said, like if people have deficiencies, then they might want to supplement initially to bring things back up to baseline and then work on their nutritional intake, or they might be people who are fussy eaters or can't digest foods for whatever reason. Like there's always more nuance than can be expressed within that episode.
Yeah, exactly. Like
go on.
I was just gonna say I take omega-3 because I don't like oily fish. So
same here. Exactly the same.
Worthwhile. And the other thing is, I've read a little bit in his book, and he talks about how you can get vitamin D from food rather than supplementing it. So then I think, well, actually, you're so adamant that you want to get this message across that vitamins are a waste of time. You're actually ignoring the evidence for people in the UK just because that's the hill you want to die on. I just think, well, actually, you could have provided some nuance and said, then 99% of the time they're a waste of time. But if you're in the UK, you should be taking vitamin D in the winter because that's actually what the evidence shows us. And that's
because you don't get enough sunshine unless you get that random like December, January day that's really sunny and you're outside for most of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which not many people can say because they work indoors.
Yeah,
and I think that's the thing as well. Like if we look at or research on mankind when it comes to food and activity, we just now need to remember in what a different world we live in compared to previous generations. Like we live in a world where the majority of us work inside behind a desk, apart from those in construction or manual labor. And so we don't move as much. And we're now in a food environment of cheap, readily available packaged foods. And it's just, but we're now in this environment. We have to do our best with it. We can't all just like change our jobs to be manual labor and, return to a different food environment. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And like we spoke about this before we started, that he had some opinions on intermittent fasting.
Yes.
And he did a decent job of explaining that that's a very broad catch-all term for lots of different things. So it can be like 5-2, it can be like prolonged fasts, it can be like some sort of 16-8 window. And I think that's an example of where whether it works or not, and it's different for everyone. It's funny because I think he says something like, over 2 or 3 years, I was skeptical, but for the past 2 or 3 years, I'm convinced it definitely works. And then says, but if it's right for you, which is it, mate?
Which is it?
I think that's an example of where there's an attractive hypothesis for something like intermittent fasting, because we weren't eating all the time. So actually, is there an argument that our bodies are designed or best adapted to having a rest from digestion rather than eating all the time? Like, that's an attractive hypothesis. It makes sense. A lot of the evolutionary arguments for food make sense, I think. So like, not paleo as in like you should be eating this, but like the idea that our body is well adapted to certain eating patterns or certain foods makes sense, but that doesn't mean it's right. It just means like, well, actually, that I can make sense of that very easily. It doesn't mean the evidence says that's true or it works for everyone. It's just it makes sense.
No, because then you get into straw man argument, don't you? Of like, oh well, this makes sense, therefore X must equal Y. That's like the whole like, oh well, carbohydrates stimulate insulin production, and when insulin is raised, the body stores fat, therefore carbohydrates equal fat gain.
Yeah,
no,
exactly. You can get people saying like
a giant leap.
Yeah, well, do you think our ancestors were eating McDonald's at 2 a.m? No, so obviously, like eating at any time in like past 12 is bad or past 6 is bad. And you think, well, you don't know, and B, that doesn't mean that our body, because our bodies are remarkably robust. So you just don't know that our body actually can't handle that relatively well. I think the sort of eating around circadian rhythms and things like that is really interesting. It's really interesting area of research.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I don't think we know loads yet.
No, we don't. And if people want to listen to that, then look up Next Step Espresso, chronological nutrition, because I did do an episode with Alan Flanagan about that.
Oh, wow.
The research that we have. Yeah, like a couple of years ago now. So I'm sure more's come out since. But to that point around fasting and the rest of digestion, I would agree, just like we talked about that difference in fight or flight versus rest and digest and what your body would be primed to do based on that situation. And that's also another reason why we are more drawn to higher caloric food, because in our previous food environment where food was scarce, if we had a high calorie meal, then we would gorge upon that to effectively store it for periods of starvation. And I mean, that's where a lot of the health at every size anti-diet crew talk about the risk of starvation, not the risk of starvation, but the risk of deprivation within someone's diet, because in the past our bodies would slow down, our movement and certain and just conserve energy for biological processes in order to conserve energy in those large periods of starvation, so that we would stay alive. And then that's the argument there for, strict calorie deficits or even restrictive dieting for prolonged periods, is that if you're doing that to your body, well, it's going to slow you down because that's what it was designed to do for survival. So you've got two sides there, like, oh, well, we were meant to have these breaks from digestion.
Yeah, exactly.
But those breaks from digestion were also when the body would slow itself down to conserve energy until you found the next wild boar to kill.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, people, anti-diet fans will say that's bad, when actually you could very easily say, well, actually that's what it does and that's what it's supposed to do. Is there another element of our environment that isn't suited to that, where it's not food? So are we supposed to eat less frequently, slow down? But the Industrial Revolution meant that 9 to 5, always on, always working. Social media means we're always turned on, and we're going too quick when our body's trying to slow down. Is that the problem? Is it nothing to do with food? And actually, should we stick to that evolutionary pattern of eating, but our lifestyle isn't designed now to be able to switch off and slow down and just lay there for long periods of time?
That's it. Well, you could, Charlie, but also you've got that idea of, if your body is slowing itself down in periods of starvation or periods of lower food intake, and you're subjecting yourself to that, but you're but you're not exercising or being active in the other periods of time, and you're sat behind a desk, and then when you do eat, your foods are of this higher caloric value, and then because of psychological deprivation or feelings of guilt, you then overconsume. It's like it's that complex environment of dieting, and then this is where interpretation and and application to the individual is more important. Because you're like, okay, we have research to suggest that this might happen. This is how our bodies were designed to act. This is what might happen because you're eating less food. but you're intentionally doing that because this is your goal, and therefore to avoid these kind of negative reactions, we need to be aware of these things.
Yeah, and I think
And that's the best that you can do.
Yeah, one of the issues with either side, like anti-diet or the opposite side, is that you will tell them this is how I feel when I do this, and they'll say no, you don't, and that's true on either side. And it's like, well, actually, when I don't eat, because often I don't eat until sort of midday-ish, and not because I want to intermittently fast, not because I want to restrict my food. I just work very hard in the morning and don't do much in the afternoon, and I'm not hungry in the morning. So that's what I do, and they'll say, well, actually, and I concentrate really well on that. No, you don't. Well, actually, I do. And also, what's really easy to do is just to explain how you feel, and then find an evolutionary reason to back it up. So I could say, well, actually, when I'm not eating, I have better concentration and clarity because, well, actually, why would our ancestors have felt really tired with no food? Because they had to hunt to eat. So if they'd have felt tired every time they didn't eat, they would have died because they would never have hunted again. So actually, do we get better focus and clarity when we're hungry? Because actually, we've got to go hunt now because there's no food. Like you can make any sort of justification for how you feel.
But then that's the issue, isn't it, Charlie? Is that you could, based on how you feel, you could find some research or some environmental factors to back up your thinking. And then you put that out to the public as this is gospel.
Yeah.
And that brings us nicely full circle to the end of the podcast of that. That's the absolute statement that you need to avoid. Like I'm listening to a book at the minute called Willpower Doesn't Work, which is all around the science around willpower and environment and creating systems and habits, and willpower being a finite resource, and you'll fall back to the levels of your environment and habit. But then even the stuff in nutrition that he speaks about, because he's not a nutrition expert, he's read willpower research.
Yeah,
that's based on his feelings of I have better energy because I'm now doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And you're like, but is that also a compounding factor that you're now getting more sleep, exercising more, because you're not relying on willpower and you've built a better set of habits? It's like, avoid absolute statements, everyone. If somebody speaks in grey terms like Charlie and I, it's not because we're boring, miserable English pricks. Well, it's not just that. It's not just that.
Why. Yeah.
It's actually because we're being as evidence-based as we can.
Yeah. And also, like, the book thing in itself is interesting because they publish all that research. You take a few years to collect it all, and then you take time to write and then publish and then promote. And then by the time it gets to you, you're probably 8 or 10 years down the line, and it could change. And that's what people don't realize about different books as well. It's like, at worst, they are utter shit, like Gary Taubes type nonsense. But even the evidence-based ones, evidence changes by the time that you get to actually like apply it. So like, if you'd have ever referenced when you were at university, if you ever referenced a book, you'd have just been slated because like, what? Like that's changed since.
Yeah, and that's difficult, isn't it? Because I'm reading, and that's why people bring out new editions of their books, which is good for them to do, because that takes a lot of energy, effort, and money.
Yeah.
Because like I'm reading Health at Every Size, as I said, and they talk about weight loss drugs and how like the two on the market at the moment are producing poor results, and you're like, well, actually, there's new ones now, and new ones now that are being backed by obesity medicine practitioners, but in the name of helping people at very larger sizes who struggle with their appetite and have a level of visceral fat that's actually affecting their health, not just for your average working mum to drop a few pounds so she feels better. So she feels better at the pool, because that's obviously not the right reason. Well, sorry, the reasons is completely up to you, but that's not health based. Which is where obesity medicine comes in for the people of kind of larger, more visceral fat areas. But we have come to time. As much as I'm enjoying this conversation,
that's fine.
I'm conscious of your time.
I don't do anything, mate. I could be here all day.
Well,
I'm sure you've got stuff to do.
I have another call. But Charlie, what do you? Where can people find you? More information on the terrible advice that you give and terrible things that you talk about.
If you want to listen to the absolute nonsense that I trot out, Instagram's probably the best place for it. So at CB Nutrition _ is where you will find me on Instagram, because at CB Nutrition was taken by some Herbalife reps, I think, when I started out. So yeah, find me at CB Nutrition _ and all sorts of crap come out.
Great. And in that time period, my dog knocked off my headphones and threw them all over the floor. But great, I'll put that into the show notes, and I'll also obviously share your podcast as well.
Yeah,
and people can check that out. So, thanks again for coming on.
No worries.
This has been Next Up Espresso. Thanks for listening. Buy everything that I create. Goodbye, everyone.